What's going on, everyone? Welcome back. Patrick here, moving on to the next example. And this example here, it's written out in the PDF file at the beginning of the section on the website, so you can print that out. You don't have to write all of this out, all of these income statements out here. And if you're watching this on YouTube, you can go to the description box where there will be a link to the course website. And there you can find a PDF that has this question and many others. So what are we working with here? We have a company who plans to expand, and below are its forecasted financials. So notice that from 2021 to 2024, we have the income statement right there from sales to net income. And then we have addition to retained earnings and then beginning equity for 2022 to 2024. And given all of that information, we have to figure out A, what is the payout ratio, and then B, is the company expanding faster or slower than its sustainable growth rate. So I'm going to do all the work up here. So let's start off with the payout ratio. Now notice from this, we can actually figure out what the retention ratio is. And notice that what is the retention ratio? The amount that's retained within the company from net income, or the addition to retained earnings, which is this row over here, over net income. That's going to give us that retention ratio. So what we can do is we can take these amounts and divide them by the net income. So starting with 2022, we'd have 3,400 addition to retained earnings, or the amount retained, over 76,000. And when you do this over here, you would get 0.4 or 40%. And actually, when you do this for 2023 and 2024, take this divided by that, take this divided by that, you would see it's always 0.4. So that retention ratio is staying constant, which means the payout ratio is staying constant. And if the retention ratio is 40%, then what is the payout ratio? Well, it's going to be 100 minus 40, which is 60%. So that's the answer to part A. 60% of these dividends here are being paid out as dividends, or sorry, 60% of these net incomes are being paid out as dividends, and then 40% of those net incomes are being retained within the company or being added to retained earnings on the balance sheet. Now, in part B, they're asking, is this company expanding faster than its sustainable growth rate? So we're going to have to find the sustainable growth rate, and we have enough information to do that. But how are we going to find at the rate at which the company is expanding? Well, what we would do is we would actually just look at the growth rate of the sales. That's the actual growth rate. That's how fast the company is going to be expanding. If you ever get a question like that, that's what they're asking for. And so notice that we can figure out the growth rate between 2021, 2022, 2022, and 2023, and then 2023 and 2024. We could actually figure out 3 growth rates of these sales between these two, and then these two. And then notice that because we're given beginning equity over here, which is going to be part of that sustainable growth rate calculation, we're given it for 2022, 2023, 2024. The reason why we're only given 3 here and this is blank is so we could compare it to the 3 actual growth rates. We could get 3 sustainable growth rates, 3 actual growth rates. So let's start off with the actual growth rates. And what I'm going to do is figure out the actual growth rate between these two first. Now, really, the sales are happening throughout 2021, throughout 2022. So the growth rate between them is going to be between both years. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to label this actual growth rate in 2022. Don't necessarily have to, but that's what I'm going to do. And the growth rate in 2022 of the sales is going to be compared to last year's sales of 300,000. So this is going to be the old amount, this is going to be the new amount. So how do you find a growth rate? New minus old over old. So we'll have 328,000 over 300,000, or minus 300,000 over 300,000, right? New minus old over old. And when you do this calculation here, you would end up with 0.0933, or 9.33%. So that's how much the sales grew from 2021 to 2022. We're just going to label it as the actual growth rate in 2022. And if we follow that same process for these two, between these two sales amounts and these two, which I did over here, actual growth rate in 2023 is 7.32%, and then the actual growth rate in 2024 is 7.95%. So we have the amount, or the percentage at which the company is actually expanding, the rate at which they're actually expanding, which is the rate at which their sales are expanding. So I'll put actual growth rate 2024, and that is 7.95%. So we're basically done the question halfway. Now what we got to do is we got to find the sustainable growth rate in each of those years. And that's pretty easy to do. We know that just in general, sustainable growth rate, what's that equal to? That's equal to return on equity times the retention ratio. Right? And notice that we have all the information for that. So return on equity is the net income. So for 2022, we're going to do this for 2022 right now. We take the net income, 76,000, and then we're going to divide it by the beginning equity of 310,000. Multiplied by the retention ratio, which we already got in part A. If you remember, it was this over that, and it's 0.4. And when you do that calculation, you would get 0.0981, or 9.81%. So that's what the sustainable growth rate is going to be in 2022. And then when you do the same process for 2023, 2024, these are the return on equities multiplied by the retention ratio, you get 9.87%, 9.41% respectively. And now that we have those rates, what we can do is we can compare the actual rates to the sustainable growth rate in each of those years. So with 2022, notice that the company is growing slower than the sustainable growth rate. Slower, slower. So just overall, the company is growing slower than the sustainable growth rate. So what we had to do, we had to calculate the actual growth rate, and that's always between the sales and then a sustainable growth rate, and then we just compare them for each